Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel and I hope you've all been doing well. Today is the big day where AMD had just announced the Ryzen 5000 series, and man did they just drop an absolute nuclear bomb on the entire PC hardware industry. So in this video we'll be talking about specs, performance gains, architecture changes, pricing, and my general thoughts on these new Ryzen 5000 CPUs. If you haven't watched the release already, I highly recommend checking it out. I'll leave a link down in the video description. Today, during the announcement, AMD had a lot to show off. Lisa started the presentation off by talking about how they worked closely with the console manufacturers, those being Microsoft and Sony, with the Xbox Series X and PS5 respectively. Though the main focus of today's announcements was going to be their all-new Ryzen 5000 platform, powered by their new Zen 3 architecture. Recapping some of their accomplishments with the previous generation, Lisa had highlighted some of them. With Zen 1 and Ryzen 1000, they brought more cores to the mainstream. With Zen 2, they had led the market in regards to aspects like efficiency. They already had strong multi-core performance and widened that gap further compared to their competitor with Zen 2. And they had also pretty good single-core performance, but not the best. Lisa mentioned that they're ambitious, and with Zen 3 set out to lead in every aspect of computing, and that includes the best single-core performance. And if you had watched the presentation, you can actually hear how many times they emphasize this and talk about single-core performance. They mentioned the phrase leadership in single-core performance many times. So Lisa had brought on stage Mark Papermaster, where he talked about some of the major architectural changes for Zen 3 and how they were able to achieve these huge performance gains. Highlighting some of the most important changes are that Zen 3 offers higher frequency, higher IPC, and a new cache topology layout. First off, he mentioned the new 8-core complex, which we've known for a while now that AMD would be heading in this direction, which instead of having 4 cores in a CCX, they'll now have 8, so essentially each CCD will be one big core complex, but we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Furthermore, he mentions that due to the new layout of the CCX, this allows them to achieve increased throughput for each of the cores to access the L3 cache, because now instead of having to split the cache among the CCXs, each core in the CCD can now access it directly with less traversal times and, having to pass information through each of the cores and then finally get it to the cache. Then he also mentions that with Zen 3, they have improved IPC by a whopping 19%, which is absolutely crazy. Of course, we still have to wait for independent benchmarks and reviews to validate these claims. However, just going off by what they said, this is the biggest leap in terms of IPC we have seen from AMD yet. And I was honestly expecting them to increase IPC by another 15%, so for them to achieve 19% has definitely exceeded my expectations as well. Zen 3 is the most significant architectural upgrade yet, and this will drastically improve single-core performance, plus along with higher clock speeds, this should put AMD well ahead of Intel. With Zen 2, AMD were already technically on par with Intel in regards to single-core performance. However, the reason why you wouldn't see that single-core performance translate well to some real-world scenarios like gaming is because they had latency issues with the architecture. So I want to circle back to the unification of the 8 cores. In this slide, you can clearly see the major difference in the layout of Zen 3 versus Zen 2. On the left, you have Zen 2, which has 2 CCXs with 4 cores each and each CCX having a cache block. The design has been this way since Zen 1, and while it was innovative, which allowed them to pack more cores into a smaller package, it did come with some drawbacks such as higher latency. Since Zen 1, AMD's intercore latency within a CCX has always been very good, on par with Intel. However, if information needed to travel outside to a core that was outside from a different CCX or thread from a different CCD, then that would incur a fairly large latency penalty. Users would often mitigate this by using the fastest DDR4 RAM they could use, or, lower timings as much as possible to help improve the Infinity Fabric's performance. Applications like games are negatively impacted by this, which is why despite AMD with Zen 2 having similar single-core performance, still lagged behind in gaming. Even if Zen 2 had clocked to 5 GHz plus, they would still be behind Intel in gaming. Many games, despite taking advantage of multiple cores, still rely on one dominant thread and use the cache frequently. So with longer traversal times for each core to access cache or pass on information from one CCX to another, it would negatively impact performance. With Zen 3, AMD have solved this by unifying the CCX into one larger CCX. Now, all of a sudden, latency will drop dramatically as each core can pass information to each other and have direct access to the cache with much less traversal time. Along with the fact that each core has access to this large cache pool will dramatically help performance in gaming, but we'll talk more about that later. Furthermore, AMD have also found a way to improve efficiency with each generation, and Zen 3 is no exception. He also mentions how their best Zen 3 CPU is 2.8 times better in terms of performance per watt over the 10900K. And at this point, AMD is really just beating on a dead horse, but nothing really to brag about as the 10900K was already a furnace to begin with. So let's move on to the different SKUs they introduced with Zen 3 in the Ryzen 5000 family. First up, we've got the Ryzen 9 5900X, a 12-core 24-thread processor that boosts up to 4.8 GHz. So that's a 200 MHz increase over the previous gen 3900X. Now what I'll say about clock speeds is that take them with a grain of salt. If we have learned anything from AMD's clock speed figures, is that what they list are single core figures under a really light workload. In heavier scenarios such as gaming, you can expect this part to probably sustain an all-core boost of around 4.5 or 4.6 GHz, with maybe some cores boosting to around 4.7 GHz, which still isn't bad by any means. However, unless AMD have made some dramatic changes to their boost algorithm that can make it more efficient, then we could see 4.8 GHz sustained even in gaming scenarios. So that could be very well beneficial. Who knows, we'll have to wait for more information from AMD on the architecture and see some testing done with these CPUs. Robert Halleck comes onto stage to talk more about the performance of this new 12-core Ryzen 5000 part. He starts off by showing Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which is a fairly GPU-dependent game but can leverage CPUs as well, but it's mainly reliant on higher single-core performance. So at 1080p, the 5900X is compared directly to the 3900X, and here in the second benchmark scene, it scores 181 FPS average versus the 141 average on the 3900X. That's a massive 28% lead. But it seems to get better as they show us a chart with more games, and as you guys can see that Ryzen 5th gen, it's going to be a massive leap over the 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs in terms of gaming performance at 1080p, where we're seeing double-digit figures increases for many games, which include popular esport titles which are heavily CPU bound like CSGO or League of Legends. In LoL, the 5900X is a whopping 50% faster. That's insane. I absolutely cannot wait until these CPUs are released because I want to do a lot of testing with these CPUs and, validate these claims for myself, but it does look quite promising. But even in AAA titles like Far Cry New Dawn, there's a massive 22% increase, and I'm happy to see that because the Far Cry games have often not performed so well on Ryzen CPUs. Along with that, we've seen in the past how the Total War games have often been very Intel favored, so the fact that we're seeing a 19% improvement there bodes well when we see the CPU compared to Intel. Seeing these kinds of performance increases means that we're truly seeing the benefits of the reduced latency and the unification of the 8 cores, along with significant uplift in terms of IPC. And Robert Halleck does mention that across those titles, on average, there is a 26% increase. That's good. No, it's actually very good, because if you've seen benchmarks from many of the big tech outlets who have done comparisons with the 10900K and 3950X, the difference at 1080p would be around 10% at most, maybe 15% for the worst case scenario. But if we can expect a 26% improvement across the board, then that could potentially mean that AMD is ahead of Intel. We also get a comparison of the 5900X versus the 10900K and Cinebench R20 single-core test, where the 5900X scores 631 versus the 544 from the 10900K. So the 5900X is approximately 16% faster there. Very nice. And speaking of the 10900K, we also get a comparison of the two processors in gaming, where the 5900X is faster in almost every title with one or two exceptions, with some CPU-bound games like League of Legends and CSGO showing massive double-digit improvements. So I believe we might be seeing a reversal of roles here, where once Intel had led by a 10% margin in 1080p gaming, now AMD will lead them by a similar margin. Moving on though, this is a CPU launch after all, and AMD isn't going to just launch one processor. Lisa had also introduced the Ryzen 7 5800X, which is an 8-core 16-threaded part, which boosts to 4.7 GHz, a successor to the 3800X. Along with that, we got the Ryzen 5 3600X, a 6-core 12-threaded part, which boosts to 4.6 GHz. Lisa had also introduced a 16-core part, the best of the best for the Ryzen 5000 series, a 16-core 32-threaded part which boosts to 4.9 GHz. Unfortunately, AMD were just off by 100 megahertz from that big 5 gigahertz mark. But oh well, it's not even that big of a deal anyways, as you guys just saw. Along with that, they also did compare this to the previous gen 3950X, and it's also immensely faster in all categories from workstation and gaming use cases. Considering what we saw from the 5900X versus the 3900X, this shouldn't be a surprise, so I won't go over all of that again. So overall, the 4 parts that AMD showed off in terms of specs, performance gains, and architectural changes look very impressive, and these parts are just going to be absolute powerhouses in every segment. Now finally, when it comes to prices that AMD announced, this is where things started to get a little dicey. The 5900X will come in at an MSRP of $549, the 5800X will be $449, and the Ryzen 5 5600X will be $299. So compared to the last generation parts, we're seeing a $50 bump in terms of pricing. I did see a lot of folks on various tech forums saying how this is too expensive and prices are higher than what they expected. And I am also leaning towards that side of the crowd as well. I was expecting AMD to keep the same MSRPs as the previous Ryzen 3000 parts, maybe at most a $20 to $30 bump. I was thinking if they truly wanted that leadership crown and wanted to put Intel into the ground, then keeping the prices lower would have definitely allowed them to achieve just that. But I guess with leadership performance comes leadership prices, right? However, it can be argued that price to performance will be the same, if not better, for these Ryzen 5000 parts, because to be fair, you are getting a larger performance leap here. The increase in IPC is higher than what Zen 2 gave you. You're getting higher boost clocks, AMD is no longer bottlenecked as severely as they were due to latency, and efficiency is also just as good, if not better. Performance all around in every aspect of computing should be significantly better. Along with that, and I'm surprised AMD didn't mention this at all in their presentation, but I think we'll also see much better memory overclocking support, with higher Infinity Fabric clocks achievable at a 1-to-1 ratio, which should also help improve performance in gaming. And yes, I know that these parts are more expensive than Intel as well, but you do get more cores in some cases. You won't have a furnace for a CPU, and along with that, single core performance is better, and you get immensely higher multi-core performance. Still, I agree that, perhaps charging $450 for an 8-core now, when the 3700X can be had for like $280 sometimes, and even Intel's 10700K goes for around like $360, still makes those parts enticing. The Ryzen 5 CPUs have always been regarded as the price to performance kings, the sweet spot category, and at $299, I just don't feel like that the 5900X will be the go-to for gamers in this sweet spot segment. And since we're on the topic of comparing older gen parts, as great as the new Zen 3 based Ryzen 5000 parts are, the 3rd gen Ryzen processors will still continue to be excellent value parts. I mean, they still offer tremendous computing performance in regards to workstation applications, they're great CPUs for streamers, and offer great gaming performance at 1080p. Maybe not the best, but it's still completely acceptable and you still will get a very smooth experience, even at high refresh rates. I've seen the Ryzen 5 3600 go for around $170 US, and that right there is impeccable bang for the buck performance. It's funny because with this new launch, I feel like AMD are now just competing with themselves. So prior to the Ryzen 5000 parts, you often saw recommendations like, if you want a good value processor for gaming and want excellent multi-threading performance, go for Ryzen 3000. If you want the best 1080p high refresh rate gaming performance, then go Intel. Now the recommendation is going to be, if you want great value, go for Ryzen 3000. If you want the absolute best of the best, go for Ryzen 5000, and leaving Intel with absolutely no room to fit in there anywhere. We of course obviously have to wait for independent reviewers and the results, but as of now, I absolutely don't see any reasons whatsoever to buy Intel anymore. None. Prior to the Ryzen 5000 launch, their only purpose was high refresh rate gaming at 1080p, but now it looks like they've lost that selling point as well, leaving them with absolutely nothing. But all in all, this launch for the most part went pretty well. Performance-wise, Zen 3 and the Ryzen 5000 parts are looking to be very impressive, setting new chart-topping performance in every category of computing. AMD have truly deserved that leadership crown here. There was a bit of a bonus at the end with a preview of Big Navi, but I'll be discussing that in another video. So I hope you guys found this video to be informative and entertaining. Leave your thoughts down below. I want to hear your guys' thoughts on these Ryzen 5000 parts. Will you be buying or upgrading to a Ryzen 5000 series CPU, or will you be sticking with the great value 3rd gen Ryzen parts? If you're interested in seeing more content like this, then make sure you're subscribed. When I get my hands on these new 5th gen CPUs, I'll be doing a lot of testing and bringing you guys lots of content. Check out the video description to support the channel and for my other videos. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you guys in the next one.